Hey everyone, welcome to Cardboard Vault. I'm Phoebe Wild and today I'll be giving you a preview of Wizards Academy, which is a game currently on Kickstarter by 3D Total Games. Wizards Academy is a cooperative game for 2 to 6 players, where you'll have to work together to save your magical university from fires, flooding, demons, trolls, and more. Unfortunately, you're not the best mages for the job. You've forgotten how to cast even the most basic spell, and you're fresh out of magical glyphs anyway. Each game you'll need to move around the university, collecting glyphs and experimenting with spells, all while managing those pesky disasters that crop up every turn. Each scenario has a different task you need to complete in order to save the university and win the game, and you need to do it before you run out of turns or the precious mana crystal is destroyed. Let's take a closer look at how it plays. This is what the board looks like, set up for the scenario Golem Construction for Beginners, where players have to construct a guardian in each corner of the academy in order to win the game. For every game, the rooms in the academy will be randomly set up, in terms of their location on the board and their orientation, but the scenario will specify the rooms that the glyphs are placed in, whether any threats start on the board, such as these guardians here, and the spells and disasters that need to be included in the game. The spell board will be set up using any spells that are specified by the scenario, as well as randomly selected spells of each level. Each level of spells will be shuffled together and laid out on the board in the correct position. For example, all the level 1 spells will be located in these 6 spaces. At the start of the game, players won't have any information about exactly which spells are included in the game, or where they're located on the board. They have to find that out by experimenting with casting during the game. All players will choose a character to play and will start at the mana crystal on the board. Each character is associated with a particular school of magic and also has a special ability that they can use during the game. On a player's turn, the first thing they have to do is play the disaster card that they're holding and take a new one from the deck for next turn. The main kinds of disasters will either create new threats in the academy, such as fire, imps, trolls, and more, or will activate threats in a specific room or rooms, causing creatures to move around and elemental threats to increase and spread. At the start of the game, disaster cards will have little to no effect, but will have increasingly dangerous impacts as more threats appear on the board and spread out of control. The deck of disaster cards will start with low-level disasters, but when it runs out, higher-level ones will be shuffled in from a progression deck as the game goes on. After the disaster card has been played, players can take 3 actions on their turn, and this will generally be a movement, a room action, and casting a spell. A move action is simply moving from one room to an adjacent connected room. Some elements, such as ice and water, will affect movement. For example, ice will cause a player to slide through the room and go out the opposite door, if there is one. Entering the room with water costs an extra movement action and will slow players down. Room actions let you do one of 2 things. You can take the action described on the room tile, or you can pick up a copy of a glyph if there is one in that room. For example, if Bramblethorn were in the library, he would be able to gain a copy of a blue glyph as a room action, or use the action described on the room, which is to bind spells. We'll get back to what binding spells does in a minute. The other kinds of room actions available will move rooms around in the academy, or create magical items such as robes, wands, and staves for your characters. Picking up glyphs as a room action is important because the glyphs need to be spent in order to cast spells. The spell action is the heart of the game. Most spells are helpful, indicated by the gold text on the top of the card, and these have a whole range of powerful effects, from eliminating elemental threats to destroying creatures, creating magical items for the players, or granting extra movement and action points. However, some spells are called botches, and are indicated by the red text on the top of the card. These spells actually have harmful effects, and can undo all the good work the players have been achieving so far in the game. Casting spells is the key to saving the academy and winning the game, but players have to be very careful about which spells they cast and when they use them, so that it doesn't result in chaos and disaster for everyone. To cast a spell, you need to first spend 2 glyphs, which will determine the spell you cast. For example, spending these 2 green glyphs would cast this spell here at the intersection of green and green on the board. After you've spent the glyphs, the card will be turned over. Some cards, such as this one, have a symbol in the middle indicating a school of magic that can boost its effect. If the spell is being cast by a player who specialises in that school of magic, or in a room that boosts that school of magic, then the more powerful effect at the bottom will also take place. Boosting a spell will turn an already good spell into an even more powerful effect, and it can turn botches from harmful to helpful. Once the effect of the spell has been resolved, it gets turned face down again, so that the players have to remember where the spell is and spend the correct glyphs again in order to cast it. However, during the game, it's possible to lock spells in place, meaning that they will be fixed face up for the rest of the game. To do this, you need to take a room action in the library or cast a spell called Scribe. And then the player taking the action will point at spells on the board one by one and name them. For example, since I know what this spell is, I could point at this one and say Call Flood. Each spell will be turned over and you'll check if the player is correct. Since I was, that card will be fixed face up for the rest of the game, and I can then choose to continue naming more cards or to stop the action. Naming more cards is a good way to fix multiple cards face up in one action, but an incorrect guess will cause damage to the mana crystal and potentially lose the game. Players continue taking turns until they either win the game by completing the scenario or lose by running out of cards in the disaster deck or allowing the mana crystal to be destroyed. So, what did I think of Wizards Academy? First of all, there are a lot of things I really enjoyed about the game. I really liked the replayability that comes with having multiple scenarios and a partially randomized setup at the start of the game. And so each scenario provides a unique challenge so that it doesn't get repetitive, because you have different things that the players are aiming to achieve during the game. And the randomized setup means that the rooms are laid out differently each game, which changes the strategies you need to use, because there are different paths to the mana crystal, the creatures will move through the rooms differently, and you need to work in different ways to protect the mana crystal and defeat the threats. So all of that will change the gameplay slightly and keep it interesting from game to game. The other thing I really like about the game are the ways that the threats interact with each other. So, for example, if water appears in a room where there's already fire, they'll cancel each other out because the water puts fire out. If fire appears where there's ice, the ice will melt into water and the fire will disappear. Demons will eat creatures and all these other things of how the elements and the creatures interact with each other. And that's really good because when you have, for example, botches that, say, for example, the botch that produces water in rooms, it's not normally a spell that you want to cast, but when you suddenly have fire overtaking the entire academy, it becomes a very useful spell in that situation. So the threat interactions mean you can be creative in how you adapt the spells to deal with the threats and manage the disasters each turn. And I really enjoyed that about the game. I also really liked, on that same note, how the scenarios aren't really linear. There are a lot of different ways to approach the problem. You have a win condition you have to meet at the end of the game, but how you get there and how you manage the threats on the way is really up to you, and it'll change each game depending on the spells that are available, how many players you have, which characters you're using, and things like that. So rather than having a checklist of things you need to do during the game, how you get to the end point is very free form, and you can be creative during the game. And I think that's a really interesting part of it. The final thing I really enjoyed about the game is how you almost have customizable characters, because you have 6 characters, I think, each with their own ability, but then you can also create magical items for them throughout the game. So you can create wands, staves, and robes. So robes will protect players from a threat, and you create them with a copy of a particular threat. So you could have a fire robe, which makes the player immune to death from fire or any of the effects of fire. And you can do the same with, could have a demon robe so that demons can't kill you, which is really helpful, and it allows your character to adapt to whichever disasters are cropping up most frequently. Staffs will let you bind a particular spell to them and cast it for free without having to have the glyphs on hand. So if you have a spell that you really need access to frequently, staffs are really useful for that. And again, that'll change depending on the situation of the game. And wands will let you bind a glyph to them and use your other glyphs as that glyph. So if you have a hard to reach glyph, for example, in one of the scenarios, the glyph number 7 is located in a room outside the academy, outside this 16-room board. And to get there, you have to cast a spell that will teleport you there and pick up the glyphs and teleport back. So you can bind that glyph to your wand so that you have it on hand and you don't have to teleport to another dimension every time you need to cast a spell with that glyph. So each of those magical items allows you to customize your character to be effective in the particular scenario they're facing. And that's a really clever part of the game. I really enjoy that. Things I didn't like about the game as much. Firstly, you spend a lot of the first 5 to 10 turns, depending how many players you are, basically just moving around the academy and picking up glyphs. Because you need glyphs to get to the fun part of the game, which is casting spells and figuring out what they do. But to do that, you need glyphs, and that just means moving around, picking them up, moving around, picking them up. Another thing I didn't like on the same note was how the disaster cards also take a little while to pick up. If you activate threats in a room without any threats, nothing happens. So you spend the first few turns kind of wandering around a perfectly safe university with nothing to worry about, and then everything escalates and you're in trouble pretty quickly. So again, it gives you a bit of a head start to learn the spells and figure out what you're doing at the start of the game before everything piles on and starts attacking you. But it does feel a little bit boring and a little bit slow until you get into things happening. The final aspect that I thought wasn't as good, and this is based on a draft copy of the rulebook rather than a final copy, so this might not even be an issue in the final game, but I found the rulebook to make the game seem much more complicated to learn than it actually is. If you have someone teaching you and once you sit down to play, it's actually very easy to get into the rhythm of how the turns play out and how the disasters work and how the threats interact, which isn't at all taking away from the strategy involved during the game. It's just fairly simple to learn the mechanics. But if you read the rulebook, it makes things seem a lot more complicated than they actually are. So hopefully that'll be edited before the final version, and it'll be easy to learn the game from that. So, overall, I think Wizards Academy is a really interesting cooperative game with some clever mechanics, especially the spellboard. The spellboard is my favourite part. I love discovering spells and adapting them to the situation that's currently going on in the university, and I think that's a really fun part of the game. And my other favourite part of it, which I've already mentioned, is that you can really be creative in how to get from the start to the final win condition, because the game doesn't dictate the steps in between, and a whole lot of different things could happen depending on the game and the random setup, etc. So each game is different. Each game you need to be creative in how you use the spells and things like that. So I think there's a lot of interesting things going on in the game. So yeah, that's what I thought of Wizards Academy. Thanks everyone for watching Cardboard Vault. If you find this game interesting, make sure to check it out on Kickstarter, and I'll see you next time.